Hey, ladies and gentlemen, we've got a great program tonight. Thank you for joining us. My name is Patrick Walsh. I'm the chairman of the Dallas Committee on Foreign Relations. And I'd like to, on behalf of you and the Dallas community, extend a very warm welcome to our distinguished guest speaker, His Highness of Iran, Reza Pahlavi. Your Majesty, welcome back. We know you're no stranger to Texas, and we're fascinated to hear some of your stories tonight. And for those of you who are attending a DCFR event for the first time, this setting is unique because we offer the opportunity in a very classy yet intimate setting to connect with a speaker in a very special way. His Majesty has insights and life experiences that all of us are hanging on the edge of their seat, anxious to hear.
Good evening. I am David Emmons. I am a member of the Board of Directors. It's my privilege to introduce tonight our distinguished speaker, His Imperial Highness Reza Pahlavi. I had a lot of remarks prepared to introduce him, and then I spent part of the afternoon with him, and a lot of my opinions changed, but I'm going to proceed with what I've got. He was born in Tehran to the late Shah and the Empress Farah Pahlavi. He was the oldest of 5 children and therefore the Crown Prince of Iran. At 17 years old, in 1977, he left Iran to continue his Air Force training abroad in the United States. Unfortunately, pretty quickly after he left, things deteriorated dramatically in Iran. I was talking at dinner tonight about that, and I was 18 years old at the time, and that's not bragging, but I was 18 years old, and I remember vividly Ted Koppel Nightline. Every night, Ted Koppel Nightline, day 100, day 130, day 200, and on and on. But the bad thing was that the theocratic regime took over at that time, and as a result, His Highness was not able to return to Iran, and he has lived in exile ever since. But even though he was in exile, he did not sit around. He earned a degree in political science from the University of Southern California. He completed the Air Force pilot training program at what used to be Reese Air Force Base here in Lubbock, Texas, a beautiful spot. And he became an accomplished pilot. He also, during his entire exile, he never lost his passion and commitment for Iran. I can tell you that is honestly the truth. It may be in Wikipedia also, but it is really the honest truth. And his patriotic fervor for his country. In fact, he tried to volunteer to be a fighter pilot for the Iranian Air Force during the Iran-Iraq War, which ran a very long time, from 80 to 88. So he was very young at the time. Of course, the offer was declined. For 30 years, or more than 30 years now, he's been a staunch advocate of freedom, democracy, and human rights. Despite his exile, he has managed to maintain his relationships with his compatriots both in Iran and outside of the country. He has traveled all over the world to meet with heads of state, heads of political parties, policymakers, lawmakers, students, groups like us to tell people about Iran. He has been a consistent critic of the oppression and abuse of citizens in Iran, and he is a staunch believer in the establishment of a secular democracy in Iran. He's published books. I think he started a broadcast company. He's got a great website. I recommend it to you. He's also married to his wife, Yasmin Etemad Amini, who in her own right is very accomplished, a lawyer and an advocate for young people. They have 3 daughters. We are very pleased tonight to have with us His Imperial Highness Reza Pahlavi, and let's give him a hand and ask him to come up.
Ladies and gentlemen, good evening.
Um, Before I start, I would like to acknowledge again people that were before mentioned, Admiral Walsh, Hugh Hackney, our sponsor, David Emmons of Baker Botts, Elliot Catanula, Frank Lloyd, all the members of the Dallas Committee on Foreign Relations, and last but not least, two dear friends who were certainly key to bringing me here tonight, George Riesenover, who I've known, dare I say, 36 years and counting, and of course, Gaurav Ganji, who is married to my dear cousin, whose counsel and advice I highly value. Thank you for making this happen. Let me start by saying this. All these years I've been talking, listening, hearing various people, decision makers, lawmakers, media, dealing with our world, and particularly the Middle East, and you would hear things such as, is there a clash of civilizations, or is this a clash of religions? Frankly, I must tell you, I don't think it's neither of the two. There is, however, a clash of values. And I'd like to start by saying this. What you're witnessing today is essentially a clash of values. You have, on the one hand, those of us who believe in principles of human rights, of equality, of democracy, of liberty and freedom. And then there are those who believe in the domination of a single ideology and make the world according to their viewpoints. Lately, I've been hearing people asking me, can Iran be a partner in fighting ISIS? And I keep saying ISIS and the Islamic Republic have far more in common being against the Western values than they have any differences among themselves. It is important to understand this very fundamental issue if you want to understand the Middle East as a whole in a clearer picture. Ever since the Islamic regime took over in Iran, it has been the godfather of radicalism, of terrorism, and what has led us to a point that today we have a situation where, unlike what it used to be before this regime took over, today you have, within the same faith, a conflict between Sunnis and Shiite. Why did it come to this? What prompted this? The world started thinking, well, should we try to pick up who's the moderate element among the radicals? Which reminds me of the time where during the Cold War some people were saying, in the Western corridors of diplomacy, how do we deal with the Soviets? Some elements may be more moderate than others. I remember the time that some people were saying, what's his name again? Andropov. Maybe we can talk to him better from a Western standpoint. How come? Well, this guy likes jazz and drinks whiskey. You know, the same thing could be said about the current leadership in Iran. Well, Rouhani is talking the nice talk. He's probably more moderate than Ahmadinejad. But one thing that is not forgotten is they end up serving the same system as the Soviet leadership did at the end of the day. They were there to serve a system. The fundamental flaw, in my opinion, on the overall Western foreign policy, whether it's the US or its European allies, has been, I think, the biggest mistake that led to a false read on the situation. Speaking of the Cold War era, those of us who are old enough to remember, is that it was definitely a bipolar world. You had two diametrically opposed blocs. On the one hand, you had the Soviet Union, this borderless international socialism or communism or whatever it is that they were thinking in a totalitarian way. And on the other hand, you had the Western free world, which of course believed in free market economy and capitalism, but most importantly, on freedom and democracy and human rights. However, even at the height of the Cold War, it was plausible for these two diametrically opposed systems to coexist at the same time in the same sphere of rationality, to the point that you could even sign military treaties despite that oddity, like SALT and MAD. The problem you have with the regime you have in Iran today is that there is absolutely no way to have an actual, plausible coexistence in the same sphere of rationality. Why? Because the entire ideology and raison d'etre of this regime is the exportation of this ideology, and their only way to succeed is to ensure the failure and the destruction of its opponent. The slogans of death to America or death to Israel is not just for purposes of propaganda. It's an actual commitment and belief in that. Even if the US was to say today, we're going to give you all the guarantees of political survival, it won't be good enough for them. Even if you have to remove all the sanctions, says, you know what, it's fait accompli, we agree to it, you're there to stay, we don't have any quarrels with them. They won't give up on fighting you. Not because they don't like you, but because in order to succeed, they have to destroy what the West stands for. That's the conflict of ideology. That's why you have attacks in Paris, or you have 9/11, or what have you. It's a value issue. Now, if the premise is based on whether or not this behavior, this comportment, this attitude is non-solvable, then let's think about what has been the essential policy of the last, say, 2 decades vis-à-vis the clerical regime. Which brings me back to the issue of sanctions, for instance. The policy of economic sanctions against Iran was not with the objective to put an end to the regime. It was mainly to try and force a change of behavior. Well, going back to what I first said, if there's an irreconcilable way of dealing with them, how could you possibly expect a change of behavior? Why would they change their behavior? If they wanted to do that, they had an opportunity 30 years ago. Why did they do it? So administration after administration, governments after governments, whether here in the United States or over in Europe, fell into this trap that perhaps we can deal with more moderate elements than others, as if you could change that paradigm. Well, Einstein said it best. Trying to do more of the same while expecting a different outcome is basically insanity. Now, another thing I'd like to add to the equation, and I have members of our Iranian community present here today who can perhaps second what I'm about to say, is that in all these years that I've been in exile in opposition to the current regime, my biggest criticism of those who have to make decisions and are involved in formulating foreign policy is that the level of dialogue you have had with Iran has been limited only to the current regime and its representatives. There has never truly been an open dialogue with the majority of Iranians who are represented by secular Democrats who can tell you otherwise. 90%, if not more than the Iranian population has been disenfranchised and is unrepresented by the current regime. Yet the only focus is how do we deal with the regime? But you haven't heard from the people themselves. And to that point, and I know there are a lot of people who are now, forgive the terminology, are salivating over the prospect of the sanctions being lifted and Iran is open for business, haven't heard from Iranians in the sense of the legitimate private sector, as opposed to having to deal with the regime and its corrupt mafia that is basically in control of most aspects of the Iranian economy. And to my first point of values, We can face a scenario whether within the next few years we might be getting pretty close to a practical third world war, whether it's declared or not, or we can have a fundamental change and making sure that the biggest stakeholders in that change are the people of that region and those who can stand alongside with them, defeating the madness that we are now witnessing, which is the root cause for instability, radicalism, terrorism, and migrants who have to end up all over the planet as opposed to be back home. Countless military people have to be dispatched to the region to no avail because the status quo continues to prevail. And in the bigger picture, I'm afraid to say that the Cold War conflict seems to be the same. The names have changed, but the games remain the same. But what can be the agent of change today, real change? I think the 20th century was an era where governments were dealing with governments. I sincerely believe that the 21st century is people dealing with people. And in that sense, what I would like to say tonight, in the brief amount of time that is available, is your focus should be on what the people in that region in particular want. Whether they are Iranians, Iraqis, Syrians, Egyptians, Saudis, you name it. What's the common element that pops up every time they have an opportunity to speak? People in that region don't want to be martyrs. They don't want to blow themselves up in some kind of crusade or jihad, as these jihadists are calling. No, they want to live like most of you want to live, in peace, in security, in freedom, in equality, when there's rule of law, when there's no discrimination because of your ethnicity, sexuality, faith, political ideology, etc. Empowerment, ladies and gentlemen, is the key to solve the problem. Some of it can be done by governments, but most of them should be done by people. And the big question mark is, what is the business community going to do? Where do you choose to stick up to some moral high ground and not be willing to do business at any cost? Today, Iran claims that it's open to business. Today, some of you might think there might be an opportunity there. The question is, how can we find a solution together where whatever you end up doing can in fact benefit the people without necessarily benefiting the regime? Or worse than that, what you end up doing could help a regime that continues to repress its own citizenry, but nothing of it will ever trickle down to the people themselves. We need to be smart about this. And one of the points that I wanted to share with you tonight, for those of you who are basically in the business aspect of things, is far beyond any due diligence that you have to do, far beyond understanding what is happening in Iran today, when there's really no standard of business practice, there's no rule of law, there's a wanton scenario where any person with a fatwa could nullify a contract, there's no security in that sense. You have to probably deal with the existing mafia. And even if you check off the mark of Foreign Corrupt Practice Act and what have you, who are you going to actually be dealing with at the expense of the people themselves? I would like to propose one thing in closing. As much as we want to fight for the values of liberty, remember it started with values, and Iranians, unlike their regime, share those values. We need to empower them, but we also need to do one thing. I would like to propose, whether it's American companies or European companies or anyone contemplating doing business in Iran, beyond any due diligence that you need to do, let's form a coalition and solidarity of people saying, if we're going to do this, it's going to be according to our terms. We're not going to betray the people of Iran. We're not going to be
going to bed with all these mafia institutions. We're going to say we will do it as long as it is clear that we're not violating any of this principle. And I guarantee you, not only this will resonate with the Iranian people, that you're aware of their expectation, but it will also send a very strong message to the regime itself that you know how to say no thanks, depending on how they're trying to posture themselves. Why is this important? I tell you why. The difference between a dark future and a bright future is a very simple proposition. It will not be any different in Tehran as it would be in Dallas for the average man on the street. It's desperation versus hope. It is no future versus a good future. It's a choice between good and evil, as opposed to a choice that Iranians have been forced to face for the past 30 years of having to choose between the lesser of the evils. Let's offer the people of that region, and in particular Iran, a choice between good and bad. And I think we need to stand with the idea that in the long run, things will work out. It's not the first time our world has been facing difficult problems. When Ronald Reagan stepped down to the stage and called for this wall to be torn down, I remember what Natan Sharansky, who used to be a dissident back in the Soviet Union, said in one of his speeches that I happened to be there. And he told all of us a story which was quite interesting for me, and I take this to heart. He said we were sitting in the gulags of Siberia, contemplating our fate and the future of Russia. And the day we saw light at the end of the tunnel, when somebody out there said, "We are with you, we're not going to let you down." A lot of changes has happened around the world. We've seen it in Myanmar with Aung San Suu Kyi. We've seen it with Nelson Mandela in South Africa. We've seen it with Václav Havel and, of course, Lech Walesa in the Eastern Bloc. And all of these movements succeeded, of course, because of the commitment and courage and determination of those who played their role. But it did not happen without the necessary support that they had from the international community. As we speak, ladies and gentlemen, we have a choice to make, all of us, that can determine the next 50 years. I'm thinking of problems that need to be resolved far beyond political situations. I'm thinking that the biggest conflict and problem that the world is facing are water shortages in the 21st century. Wars can break out over water. Forget about oil. That's an old conflict. We need to master all of our resources, of technologies, of food management, of what have you, of population control and climate change and environmental issues. We don't have time for a Sunni-Shiite conflict. We don't have time for radical terrorism. And if I let it happen, we can't afford to pass this on to the next generation. There won't be a planet for them to live in peace. We need to start now, when there's still time to correct the direction that the world could possibly take. And what's interesting is that those who stand against us are very clearly at the losing end of this proposition. The problem is that their resolve to fight, their resolve to succeed, at this point, in my view, seems to be far more than our resolve to make sure that they lose, because it's black and white. Either we win or they win. There's no middle point. They have to lose, and we have to win. It's a question of resolve. It's a question of determination. It's a question to say it is no longer acceptable. And those who will fight it are already in place. I stand here to attest to you that my fellow compatriots, despite the humiliation, despite the hardship, despite the repression, every single day are bravely and courageously resisting their oppressors. When an Iranian teacher or factory worker or engineer or even in terms of income, you're talking about them making an average of maybe $300 to $400 a month in terms of salary, who are being given some token gesture of monthly help, which is the equivalent of about $12 or $13 right now, and hear that the regime is willing to pay some Hezbollahi radical element out of Lebanon who will attack Israel, promising them $7,000 a head for anybody who will be martyred in the process, or compensate them should their home be destroyed, over $30,000 according to the Iranian ambassador over there, which is more than almost 8 years of a teacher's salary. What do you think those people are going to think? Where is the world in all this? Whose side are they on? This is an opportunity to make sure that that call will not be unanswered. Now, I can assure you that I, for one, am doing all I can to help our compatriots liberate themselves. And those of you who know Iran and Iranians know that what this regime stands for has nothing to do with how an Iranian thinks, how they react, how they value the principles of freedom. It's part of our DNA. We are the first country who can claim that we coined the very principle of human rights 2,500 years ago under Cyrus the Great, who was the first one to make that declaration, whose tablet is now in the UN and Hall of Nations, alongside one of our poets, Saadi, who talked about people of the planet being of one limb. This is part of Iran's contribution to civilization and continues to be to this day, and it will be shameful. It will be simply historically criminal not to give those people a chance to prove themselves, not just in the interest of Iran itself, but for the sake of world peace and stability. They are your best allies. They've been ignored for 35 years and counting. Let's change that paradigm, people. Let's empower them. Let's help them. Let's give them courage. Because as I said, there's no message stronger than hope. And light is at the end of the tunnel, and it has already started. So be careful what you hear in terms of the regime's promises right now. Make sure that the standards and the values that we all aspire to are the ones who have to stand up at the end and prevail, not the values and principles of the dark-sided people who today have emanated in the form of the current regime in Iran or ISIS or what have you. This is a great opportunity, and I'm sure there are a lot of questions here, but I wanted to leave you with this thought that at the end of the day, don't forget, we share the same values, and these values are not to be negotiated on. This is the line we draw in the sand. In every fight, there has to be a winner and there has to be a loser. Let's hope that we are the winners and they are the losers. Thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you.